Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome to what is going to be the first video that we are doing for AP English Literature and also English 12. I remember I kind of spliced the two classes together. So if you're in AP English Literature or if you're in English 12, don't worry. I mean, we're doing the same essential materials, just at different levels and different depths. So I thought it would be fine and appropriate to kind of meld the two together pretty seamlessly. So the first section that we're going to do is within the unit, various texts. And just like we did in English 11, we're going to look at a bunch of different genres of texts here, starting for 12th grade with biblical literature. Now, part of the reason that we do this, and part of the reason that I really do insist, especially in a 12th or an AP literature class or any class that's really centered on literature, is because biblical literature, guys and gals, is one of the major influences on English literature overall. So if you're reading Shakespeare, if you're reading, stuff in the medieval era, if you're reading stuff in the late Enlightenment or Enlightenment or anything really, in the past major kind of periods of Western civilization for the past, I would say 2000-ish years, biblical literature has had an immense influence on those works. And a little bit more of it in a somewhat more removed sense at times, because biblical literature, meaning basically the Bible, right? Meaning both the Old and New Testament, so the books of the Jewish texts of the Torah and all that kind of stuff, and also the texts of the Christian Gospels and the Christian New Testament. All of those together created what has essentially become, for better or for worse, depending on your point of view, the dominant philosophy and the dominant worldview that was established after Christianity essentially took over Rome from the inside out. And as a result of that, after Rome had kind of, established its dominance and its attempt to basically create some kind of hegemony and collective, what do you want to call it? Systematization of the civilizations that it had touched or conquered, then Christianity, basically kind of blooming out of Rome, really kind of spread Christianity quite radically and quite dramatically throughout the world. And then, of course, what we ended up seeing throughout history, again, for better or for worse, depending on whatever historical perspective you want to take or philosophy you want to take on the subject, Europe and the world that Rome had essentially created essentially influenced an immense amount of influence on the rest of the world, particularly of the West and also a significant part of the East. And so what does that mean? That means that basically the philosophy that guided or that was undergirding a lot of the behavior and views of these people that created the civilization that we see around us today was influenced by this work, by the text of the Bible. And so thus any artwork that culture, our culture, has produced has its roots fundamentally somewhere in biblical literature. Now, of course, post-Enlightenment time, as the Enlightenment has kind of begun to, get further and further away from us, and ever since the Enlightenment, we've seen that people have very much tried to introduce what's called secularism, right? The idea that we can remove ourselves from religion pretty dramatically. And that in and of itself, historians can argue about it all the time, and, you can take your own opinions on it if you want. Some historians say that move in and of itself is still a very Judeo-Christian idea, the idea that we can somehow, separate church from state. Other religions in the world did not do that. That was definitely not a thing. So Christianity producing a culture that would allow you to separate the two, that's a little bit unique. But, either way, the point is that we have had, since the Enlightenment and then the modern era, we've had more literature that tries to separate itself more and more from this philosophy, this worldview, although still being naturally influenced by it to some degree, because it is coming out of that worldview, it is coming out of that culture. You cannot help but be influenced by it. Again, for better or for worse. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through relatively quickly 4 different texts, technically 4. We're going to go through a segment of Genesis, or of the third book of Genesis. Then we're going to go through a quick segment of the next book, the 4th book of Genesis. And then we're going to look at a quick passage from the Gospel of John. And then we're going to look at a kind of small compilation of passages from the Gospels. So we're going to look at 4 biblical texts. technically four, not really, it's really like a bunch, but it's basically four sections that I'm laying out for you. And what I want us to do is read through it, generally in a moderate amount of depth. Read through it, try to understand what it's saying in and of itself, like what is the genre, what is the text presenting to us, what is it trying to tell us? And then step back, answer the questions on the particular text, but also then kind of like step back another step further and basically say, hey, what is this text maybe saying about reality? What is the philosophy that is being espoused in this particular text? What is it saying about the nature of the world? And then as we do that, we're going to kind of look using our different lenses, our multiple different lenses. We're going to see where we could see interesting interpretations of these texts and what they might have to tell us. Now, of course, it goes without saying, are we preaching here? Am I slowly trying to preach you into a position where you believe the Judeo-Christian worldview? No, that's absolutely not what we're doing. This is simply a literary endeavor. I'm simply trying to educate you to the best of my ability, generally, to understand Western literature in a much more deeper way. And I, of course, like I've said in other videos, like I said in other settings, I would go so far as to say, as a teacher of English literature, if you don't understand the Bible or biblical literature, let alone biblical philosophy, biblical ideas, you just will not understand Western literature at all. Like I've seen people try to tackle the great works of Western literature, most notably something like Dante or something like Milton's Paradise Lost. And it's so clear that these people have never really understood the philosophy of Christianity or the philosophy of Judaism. And they don't understand what they're really looking at. And so they look at it in a kind of a twice removed sort of sense, and they actually misinterpret it pretty dramatically. So I think it is actually very important to understand this stuff. And if you're, of course, a religious person, you're going to think that it's really, really important. But if you're not a religious person, it's still worthwhile to understand, particularly also if you're an atheist, because you might want to know exactly what it is that you are rejecting, all right, which is fine, all right? So with all that out of the way, let's look at the first text. It's Genesis 3, the fall. Now, we immediately begin with some controversial or some complicated topics with trying to place the genre of our text, right? Like what I always tell us to do is before we read something, it might be useful to maybe step back, look at the title, consider the genre, consider the author. Do we know the author of Genesis? We don't, all right? We don't actually know who wrote this. We know the tradition that it came out of. Of course, some Christians are going to say that it was inspired directly by God or the Holy Spirit. Some people will say that it was created as a tradition that was handed down through generations, much earlier than whatever date we would place it as being written on. But all the same, guys, we don't generally know who wrote it. Generally, we're going to say, okay, it's Jews, right? It's people who adopted the Judeo worldview. And then, of course, the Christians agreed with it centuries and centuries later. However, a more interesting question, I think, is what genre is the book of Genesis? How are we supposed to read, maybe especially the early books of Genesis? It's a famously controversial issue. And fun little history lesson, of course, it's really only controversial for us or only became controversial for us in the past, 300-ish years. After the Great Awakening in America, which of course came as a response to Darwinian science and increasing secularization in the cultures of Europe and America. What essentially happened was that the Christians in America became essentially quite nervous and quite threatened and quite at odds, let's put it that way, at odds with the culture that was emerging around the sciences in Europe as a result of Darwin's theories and other people that were speaking and writing at the time. And as a result of this, they felt as though their influence they felt that the influence of religion and the role of religion was being seriously threatened, and they didn't want to let that go. And they thought, no, this is really, really dangerous. That what we're doing here, we're going to completely evict the Bible. We're going to evict this philosophy that we've been carrying for thousands of years. So let's do the best we can in the form of creating what we call fundamentalism, where we just create a tradition where we are going to read the Bible. The Bible is going to be central, and whatever the Bible says is what we're going to believe. Period. End of story. Even if it sounds completely literal, even if it runs completely in the face of scientific evidence that we have at the time. So that's probably the most sympathetic way I could put fundamentalism to us. So that's where we get the idea that we need to read Genesis as what? As a literal historical scientific text. Okay, that tradition generally, most famously, I would say, comes out of the fundamentalist tradition of America. Now, you might notice something. I said it's like 300 years we've been doing that for. Well, what were we doing for the other 1700 plus years, more like 2000 plus years of people reading Genesis? Did they read it literally? Did they read the first 3 to 4 books, maybe 5 books of Genesis like a literal history text? Not always. In fact, there is a good amount of evidence to show that the majority of Jews and Christians actually read Genesis as something that we generally don't know what the genre is. They read it kind of ambiguously. They were like, it sounds like myth. It sounds like some kind of spiritual text, but it doesn't necessarily need to be literal. And this is something, again, we need to kind of broaden our horizons about, guys. A lot of my students are really fixated on reading things either as completely fictional or completely what's called non-fictional, so factual, right? And in the sense of like, oh, it's got to be complete historical scientific fact, or it's got to be complete myth and nonsense. We need to understand that even if something is mythic, it can still, or nonfiction, I'm sorry, fiction, it can still convey very deep truths to us. In fact, maybe even deeper truths that can't as easily be expressed in nonfiction forms. So if you're a religious person and you're hearing me say, oh my God, Genesis is all a myth, or is a myth, that shouldn't be all that threatening to you, because first of all, the tradition that you're probably from, which is Christianity and Judaism, is totally open to saying that. They're like, yeah, we can still say Genesis is a myth. We can still say the Big Bang Theory, which was obviously created by Catholics, by the way, it was Georges Lemaitre, formulated that thesis first and foremost. Again, showing that these older Catholic traditions don't really have a problem looking at this as a myth. That doesn't detract from faith at all, okay? Now, if you don't want to give that up and you want to be a fundamentalist and say, no, it's probably literal, then fine, do so. But of course, we always want to question and make sure that we are trying to be as logically consistent as possible. So for the sake of historical tradition, we're going to look at Genesis as if it were a myth, as if this is a creation myth, which a lot of historians and a lot of literary experts, when they read this, that's immediately what they recognize it as. We're not going to read the creation account, though. We're going to read the fall. So all of that all out of the way, let's actually look at the text and see what it says. So here we go. Genesis 3, the fall. Number 1. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, that is, of course, the serpent said to the woman, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? Number 2, the woman said to the serpent, we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it or you will die. Number 4, you will not certainly die, said the serpent. The serpent said to the woman, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Okay, so in the first 5 lines of chapter 3 of Genesis, or book 3 of Genesis, we see the famous account of the temptation of Eve from the serpent. So a couple different things. We got a lot going on here. God obviously has organized creation so far, with human beings being kind of like the pinnacle of creation, right? We talked about that in my my humanities course. So if you want to get the background on Genesis, go check out, I think it's the first reading on Judaism in that particular series. And then that actually ends, or it kind of leads us up to this point. So the serpent comes in and is described as crafty. Now, crafty is an interesting translation of the original Hebrew. You could say wily, you could say clever, you could say cunning. What is not said is wise, right? He is not wise or necessarily simply intelligent. So he's not just knowledgeable, he's not just wise, he's actually very tricky, very crafty. Okay, so that's an interesting link right off the bat between this character who is very clearly nefarious, right? Who is very clearly a malevolent figure, very clearly linking him with a trait or with a characteristic of cleverness and cunningness, right? This is something that's relatively suspect in our imagination, right? So keep that in mind, right? The role of an intellect that has gone off the path of simple wisdom, right? Of deep wisdom. So we have the serpent, it tempts Eve, it said, but it doesn't do that, first of all. It begins by doing what? By asking her, did God really say you must not eat from the tree in the garden? Now, I love this passage because this is like a huge indictment of so many English teachers, right? Adam and Eve are given this very clear dictate, which is don't eat this particular fruit. What can you do? As Eve then tells us, God told us that we could eat any of the fruit in the garden. God says we can. What was the situation in Eden? Of course, it was essentially we Adam and Eve get to sit here, we get to make babies, and we get to kind of work the land. Generally kind of naming things and just keeping the garden up to snuff. That's it. And we're allowed to eat anything else we want in the garden except this particular fruit. But of course, the serpent comes in and asks that question. Is that really what he said? Is that really what it is? What is behind that question? Behind that question are two different things. Number one, the desire to actually eat the fruit. Okay, so the lusting or the greedy, the gluttonous kind of reaching for that particular fruit, for all things. We want to have all things. And then deeper still behind that is this rejection or this kind of rebellion against the authority of God. So God gives you essentially this situation, which, let's be fair, is literally a paradise, is literally like a sandals resort on steroids. And you choose, and you have still, even with all of that, there's one small thing we can't do, right? We cannot eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That is what the serpent is kind of moving you towards. It's like, ignore all the things you can do. Let's look at the one thing that we can't do. Good little insight into human and really very much childlike psychology right there, right? We're going to fixate on the negative. We're going to fixate on our limitation, right? Now look at all the other things we have. So he does this. And like I already said, frankly, it's a stupid kind of temptation because it's like, yes, he did really say that, and we should have just like shooed the serpent away at that point. But no, she doesn't. She gives him the actual dictate that we just said. And in this phrase, die, right? This is where we have this little debate with the serpent. The serpent says, you will not certainly die. For God knows that when you eat it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Now, again, guys, the serpent is what kind of narrator? Even though he's not a narrator, he's what kind of narrator, what kind of speaker? He is an unreliable one. We know that his intentions are negative. He's trying to push us towards something that is eventually going to lead to suffering. So he's not a very trustworthy figure. So when we look at a phrase like this, where he's telling us the thoughts of God, should we really take that with any degree of seriousness? Probably not. Now, what's annoying about the demonic, right? What's annoying about the satanic intellect is that it really confuses us by dropping in elements of truth and then weaving them together, mixing them together with so many lies, so that we really can't untangle, wait a minute, which part of this is true, which part is not true. That's why generally like a good idea is to simply say, this is probably not true. But for us, looking at the whole situation here, we could maybe try to tease out a little bit, even though if you ever come into contact with a demon, let's just not listen at all, just in case. Now, what is going on here with the word die, right? And this is interesting because you see Eve talking about this. She says, we're going to die if we eat or touch the apple or the fruit, rather. It's not an apple. So we don't want to do that. And he says, no, you're not going to die. So what do we mean by die here? Because it's not a poison fruit necessarily, because we know they're going to eat the fruit and they don't just drop dead right there. Death does enter into the world in some sort of mystical sense. They do die years and years later. Were we ever told that they weren't going to die? I think we are told something like, there's some, ideas that might have been what's going on, but I don't think there's any clear phrase that tells us that Adam and Eve would not ever have died. So it's interesting. What do we mean by death then? And the serpent kind of echoes this doubt and says, well, no, you're not going to die. Okay. So is he correct? Biologically, it seems at least somewhat, yeah, at least half correct. You're not going to die right now. But what I'd like to suggest, guys and gals, to you and to most people who go trying to look at this particular story, and also, by the way, most people who try to look at particularly the Old Testament, is to readjust or kind of reconsider what we mean by the term death here. To introduce us to a little bit of the Greek language, we know that the term life has maybe two different uses. There's two different words in Greek that define or describe life. And what we usually think of them is the first one, the bios, right? Bios, like we get biology. We think of bios as the main word for life, and it's opposite, thanatos, with this term of death. So when we're thinking of the abdication or the ending of life, we think of bios. We think of our long biological physical life. And I usually use that metaphor. It's a vertical, I'm sorry, it's a horizontal kind of life that keeps going from 1 year, 1 minute, 1 day to the next. Is there another form? Yes, the Greek language uses the term zoe to describe this other form of life, which is a vertical form of life. Now, what is that? That's talking, I think, very clearly about spiritual life. Now, what is that? You know, if you want to use more secular language, you can call that psychological life, psychological health. We, of course, reading a text like this, want to say it's more like spiritual health, something like that. So this dynamic between biological life and zoological life is a major kind of idea in the Bible. It's never clearly described outright like that, but I think it's very clearly illustrated in other ways. Like, for example, Christ, as we don't see it, I don't think, in the passage we're going to look at today, but Christ, for example, very, very often uses phrases like life and death, life and death. He's not, I don't think, talking simply about the physical death of the body and then the resurrection of the body. I think he's also referencing this idea of spiritual life and spiritual death and whatever the consequences of those may be. So guys, I think what is going on here in Genesis is a discussion on that same topic. If you eat this fruit, if you break God's commandments, you will begin to spiritually die. Okay, whatever that may look like, right? That's what's going to happen. Now, the serpent says his suspicious line is that God knows that when you eat it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Okay, will Adam and Eve be like God if they eat the fruit? Yes, in the sense that they are now taking on to themselves the role of what? The commandment makers, right? God isn't the one who sets the boundaries of reality. We are. And that, guys and gals, is a very clear articulation of what sin or what tragic flaw. That is the sin of pride. That is the sin of hubris. That is self-centeredness. That is self-referential behavior. That is saying that no, God doesn't set the boundaries of reality. Reality itself has no rule over reality. I get to decide reality. I make my own reality. I define the limits of reality, the good and evil of reality, all this kind of stuff. I think that's really what's being laid out here. So he is correct in that, and knowing good and evil. Now, he, of course, the way he phrases it is like as if God is afraid of what of like a threat that Adam and Eve could pose to him. It's stupid on the face of it, right? Like that's not clearly what God is afraid of. I think, knowing the character of God in the Old and New Testament, it's very clear that what God does not want to happen is that spiritual death. He wants people to live in full abundance. And I mean, like, look at all of that he allows you to do. He allows you to do so much. And then he basically just says, hey, just avoid these really toxic and dysfunctional things. In other words, listen to me. I'm like a doctor in that sense. I know what's good for you. But of course, human beings and the serpent here are being kind of shown to not be as trusting as you might want to be towards a figure like that. Okay, so he makes this temptation. Of course, we can see right here, we don't need to read it, that Eve eats it. And we get this interesting passage that she gave some to her husband who was with her, that is, of course, Adam, and he ate it. Now, notice what we're not told. We're not told, did she trick him into eating it? I mean, his phrase later when he tries to defend himself kind of implies that she tricked him, but it's not totally clear if she did or not. Milton, of course, is going to take this, which we might read later in the year. Milton, of course, takes this line and extends it into a long debate almost between Adam and Eve, where Adam and himself, because Adam in Milton's Paradise Lost knows what Eve is doing, and he chooses to eat it anyways because he loves her and doesn't want to be separated from her. Now, number seven, when the eyes of both of them were open, they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. So the nakedness thing here, I think this is very clearly a symbol of shame. They are aware of their own limitations. They're aware of what they have done wrong, which is, of course, the fact that they broke God's commandment. Now, that's a good point, by the way, guys. I think Genesis is very clearly inviting us to see that the fruit isn't what is inherently evil, right? That's not bad. What's bad is the fact that you broke the commandments. That's what's bad. So it's not like, sin and death enter the world when they bite the apple, because the apple inherently is like mystical and magical and can do that. I think what's very clearly going on here is that as soon as they make the conscious choice and action to act against God, that is what kind of brings sin into the world, right? So they have twisted their nature in that moment, okay? So let's see. And then we go on from 8. The man and his wife heard the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid. And God calls, "Where are you?" Now, it's again kind of one of those things that hints that this is being kind of more mythic and anthropomorphic, right? Does God really not know where they are? And now that kind of also brings up a point which we'll touch on a bit later. Does God really not know where they are? Hold on to that for a minute. The next one. He answered, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." And he said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?" So again, God's questions are what sound like very clearly rhetorical questions. Does God really not know the answer to these questions? God is omniscient. Of course, God knows. So what is he doing with Adam here? I think, aside from possibly this just being really, really anthropomorphic and mythic, if you want to say that, that's fine. I personally like the reading that this is God doing something similar that he's going to do with Cain and Abel, in Cain and Abel rather, which is trying to get people to tell the truth and to confess. Okay, so the first step towards healing, the first step towards kind of improving one's situation, as according to the narrative here, is you need to make a complete and honest confession, which is, guys and gals, a movement away from another toxic trait that we see in this story, which is self-deception, right? We're going to see that in Cain and Abel very clearly. This idea that you can lie to yourself, you can hide from the truth that you consciously or subconsciously know at some degree. This deep kind of pattern of self-deception that we can practice, that we very much do practice as human beings. God is trying to get you to stop that in this passage, I think. He's trying to say, no, tell me the truth. Tell me exactly what you did. Confess it, okay? Say it out loud, so that we know exactly where we are and what we're dealing with. That is the only way we can move forward and heal any of what's going on here. And so notice what Adam does. Is he very honest? Not really. He says, "The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree and I ate it." It's not outright, but I mean, like his rhetoric, his tone very clearly seems like he's pointing fingers. He's saying it's her fault. Okay, she did it. Okay, did she? Well, yeah, but I mean, like, it's a lot. She, then me, right? Then I ate it. Okay, so Adam is pointing the finger quite a bit. Maybe he is. So for passage 13, he says what? It says what? Then the Lord God said to the woman, "What is this you have done?" So in other words, you tell me. Same thing to you. Explain what you did. The woman said, "The serpent deceived me and I ate." Notice the difference here. The woman, you, she, and then I. And then here it's the serpent, me, and I. Okay. So yes, you were deceived by the serpent. That is true. But I ate it. Simple, to the point, clear cut. Okay. So who's a little bit more virtuous there? I think there's an argument to be made that Eve is a little bit more humble and virtuous there. And by the way, Milton again picks that up. We see that in Milton, Adam just rants and rages all the time about, or to God, about what Eve has done. And then Eve, when she talks, it's like a small, barely even a paragraph. She's like, "The serpent did me beguile and I did eat." It's like one line, again, showing a little bit more humility, a little bit more willingness to accept your own responsibilities. So the God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, you will be cursed," blah, 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 blah. He gives the curse to the serpent. And of course, we get this last line that, "I will put enmity between you and the woman and your offspring, and then he will strike your head, he will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." basically introducing the point that there's going to be some serious animosity between serpents, between animals, between nature and human beings now. And we're not going to have any more dominion over nature. We're going to be struggling with nature from here on out. Okay, so it's the first thing. There's a problem, right? There's a contested relationship now between wildlife or other life around us and human beings. Okay, so that's the first negative thing that enters. The woman said, to the woman he said, I will make your pains in childbearing very severe with painful labor, and you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Notice that this is a curse almost. Okay, this is essentially a curse. This is the punishment. Pain in childbirth, labor in childbirth, sure. Your desire will be for your husband. Okay, now that's interesting. Isn't that already kind of there? Maybe. I don't know about this line right here. And he will rule over you. So that ruling over you kind of thing, this idea that we have to now be subjugated to our husbands if you're a woman, is part of God's curse. Implying, by the way, that that's not a great deal. It's not a great situation. Maybe. And whatever it is, it's a result of the fallen world or our fallen natures. Maybe. I don't know. There's a lot of complexity around gender roles in this particular story. And then 17, he says to Adam, because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. From dust you are, and to dust you will return. Okay. In other words, Adam is going to have to work, and then die. Okay. Eve, same thing. You're going to have to work with child labor and all that kind of stuff, and then die, and then have to listen to your husband. So bad deal for both of them, it seems like. And Adam named his wife Eve because she would be the mother of all the living, all this kind of stuff. The Lord God, made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. And the Lord God said, the man has now become like us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. So the Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken. After he drove the man out, he placed on the east side of the garden a cherubim and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. Okay. So God in this story is saying, okay, fine, you're clothed now. I can kind of cover you up, cover the shame that you were feeling up now, and send you out into what is now a fallen world, so that you have to essentially suffer through whatever it is that you are now going to suffer through in this dysfunctional and fallen world. And he says you can't eat from the tree of life and live forever. Now, why not? He kind of echoes the serpent and says we must not be allowed to reach out and take his hand and also eat from the tree of life and live forever. Again, on first reading, this again sounds like very jealous God, very kind of threatened God, that we don't want them to reach up and become like us. I don't think that's a proper reading, though, because again, God is always defined as singular and unique. There's nothing that could be like God. All that's being kind of shown here is that God doesn't want these guys to grasp, to continue grasping up at their, what do you want to call it, their development in some way, shape, or form. He wants to be the one who decides when their development happens. And I think that's the proper reading of this story. I don't think like the story of Prometheus, which we're going to look at, this is a story of a jealous God trying to keep human beings down in the dust underneath his foot forever. I think this is more the story of people needing to learn their place and follow the commandments of a God who does wish goodness for them. Okay, I think God, again, God's nature is good, God's nature is loving, and all this kind of stuff in this worldview. And so if we want to read it with that in mind, I think that really changes our understanding here, because the trust of God, the love of God is kind of the fundamental point that people miss in these stories, I think. So if God is good and loving and all this kind of stuff, then he has reasons for not wanting us to do these things, which we innately would not comprehend. And so therefore, I think it makes sense that he would say, do all these other things that you want, but just wait on these things yet. Don't eat this yet. And there is a Christian tradition, and I think also a Jewish tradition that says that God had planned and did want Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of life and from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So that's kind of what was going on there. Maybe that's one reading of it. Okay, let's look at their questions now. What are the predominant images and symbols in this story? What might they represent? Well, we touched on a few, right? The serpent, the garden itself, the tree, right? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the fruit in that tree. All of these things are symbols. Additionally, the nakedness, right? The idea of nakedness, the idea of covering up, all of this is fine. The image of the cherubim with the flaming sword, right? The angel with the flaming sword that guards the way of the tree, guards the way to the tree of life. We didn't talk about that one though. That's a really unique symbol. I think very clearly what it is, it's a symbol of purification. It's a symbol of cleansing in some way, that it's going to kind of slash away all things that are unworthy and burn away all things that are unworthy. We get that actually echoed in the poetry of Dante when he shows us that in order to kind of enter into Eden, you must be kind of purged of your sins, your final sin, which is of course lust in Dante, I think. But yeah, here I think it's the same thing, right? So all these other symbols very clearly have a lot of meaning behind them. I'm not going to go through each one, but we kind of discussed a little bit about them. So tell me what you could write there for each of them. For number 2, what is the limitation placed on Adam and Eve in the story's exposition, and what might this represent? Again, representing that you can do anything you want. You have so much freedom and liberty. You have so many sources of joy. But do me a favor, as God basically says, and don't eat from this particular tree. Okay, that's it. And I think that is simply representing not God being covetous and tyrannical. I think that is showing that human beings are meant to enjoy creation and enjoy life in abundance with each other in the parameters of God, within the parameters that God sets, which is a good deal, it sounds like, right? Like it's a positive thing. Again, so many people read this in a very cynical and very skeptical kind of postmodernist light. I don't think that that is that easy, right? It's not easy to do that because again, you have look at the trees as an example. You can eat all these trees, but just one tree you can't eat from. It's like it sounds like a really libertarian God, in some sense. Okay, number 3, consider the actions of Adam and Eve after being tempted by the serpent. What might be the significance of the order of events, symptoms, and the consequences here? So the actions of Adam and Eve being tempted by the serpent. So after they are tempted, right, they pass along their sin. She passes it to him, and then they try to hide, right, because they are aware that they have done something wrong. I think that's kind of what it means when their eyes were open, knowing good and evil. Like Milton's interpretation, I think, is right. That they realize, oh, this is what good and evil are all about. This is what it means to do wrong. I have just done something wrong. Now I understand what that is. They know this, and then they run away and try to hide, right? They try to cover up their shame. Now, and then of course they have to they try to hide it and confess it, and then they are given the punishment afterwards, right? So I think what's happening there is very clearly a sequence of what we do when we do something wrong, when we experience guilt and shame and have to recover from that. Number 4, explain how God behaves in this passage and how might this help readers identify the genre. Again, I think that we talked about that. It sounds very anthropomorphic. It sounds very mythic. Hence, I think this is a creation myth. Number 5, what happens to the world as a result of God's curse? This is one of the main points here, is that not only showing the nature of human dysfunction at its core, but also showing and establishing for the worldview that this text gives rise to, establishing that the world is now defined inherently by its brokenness, by its flaws. We, as part of that, also are flawed and broken in many different ways, okay? So the flawed and the inherent sinfulness or sinful nature of the world is something that is established now, that there's a tainted aspect to reality now, okay? We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Number 6, what new limitations and laws are placed on Adam and Eve in the story's conclusion? Of course, that is the limitations of their pain, their suffering, their different roles they have to now play with each other, and also the presence of death, right? So the clear articulation of death, at least for the first time. I think that's all part of the new limitations now, okay? So what insights might this story be trying to convey? Okay, ultimate question there. Well, couple different things. Number one, I think, is our relationship to reality. And I like to use reality, depending on what lens you want to look at this through. We can substitute the term God with reality itself, right? If you want to be an atheist and look at this very, very psychologically or very, very kind of sociologically, I think that's what's going on here, is that the author is treating God as the author of reality, as the source of reality itself. So what we're getting here is a text that tells us something about our, like, human beings' relationship to reality, to the world. We are very unique, as the earlier books of Genesis showed us, because we are self-aware. We can actually observe reality and ourselves within it, very much like God can. So we're the closest thing that we know, at least, the closest thing to being like God. And I think what this is showing us is that our relationship with reality is one of struggle, is one of wrestling, right? We are given so much by God in this story, and then we still rebel against it. We still don't simply sit there with joy and peace and gratitude. We still want more, showing us that there's something, again, broken within our relationship to reality in that regard, okay? And then also showing us, by the way, maybe the second thing here, which is the second insight, which is that our deepest dysfunction, our deepest flaws, our deepest tragic behavior and sinful behavior comes from this inability to accept the way reality is set up. We are not able to accept that we are not the authors of reality, that we have to subjugate ourselves, that we have to listen, there's the bell for class, that we have to listen to someone else for the rules of reality, right? We want to be the ones who dictate what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is evil, what is, what isn't, what should, what shouldn't be. We want to be the ones who dictate that. Whereas this story is very clearly putting forward the philosophy that that is not our role. We are subject to higher powers into a greater reality, and we need to sync our will up with that, or not, without reality. We need to synchronize our will with that reality. And if we don't, that is when evil and dysfunction begin to enter the world. And that is where suffering begins to really, really enter the world, okay? I think that's what this story is fundamentally conveying, among other things, okay? Those are two really major things I think that are being conveyed here. Okay, so that is Genesis 3. Let's look at Genesis 4 now. Really, really quickly. Adam and Eve make babies, right? This is something, again, we learned from the passages, the humanities class, is that, making babies is a great thing in the Judeo-Christian religion. So Cain and Abel are our first real humans in some sense, right? They are the first humans born of human. So we get this passage describing them. Now, Abel kept flocks and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from the firstborn of his flock. Okay, so really quickly, we have here the practice of sacrifices, which, again, we in our more modern, quote unquote, enlightened context may look at that and think, oh, that is really, really primitive and foolish and yada, yada, yada. But again, the principle of making sacrifices is something very familiar to us. We all in our lives sense the need to give something up in order to get more later, right? It's a very fundamental principle, all the way from, what we want to do when we need good food or when we need money, all the way up until we want to how we would want fundamental happiness in relationships in life. We need to give something up in order to get something greater in the future. So the ancient world, of course, would practice that out, or at least symbolically, or sometimes very, very literally practice that out in the form of ritual sacrifices in religion. And so what is going on here is that Cain and Abel are at some deep fundamental level trying to give something up that they have worked for, something that is close to them, something that is worthy to them. They're giving up something of worth in order to get something of worth back from God, or if you want, from reality. That's what they're doing. Now, what is the characterization of Abel and Cain here? Cain's the older one, Abel's the younger one. Abel is a shepherd. He is giving forth the fat of animals. And then Cain is giving forth, we can assume, fruit or vegetables or kind of plants that he has tilled the earth with. Okay. Now, which is the better sacrifice? It's an interesting question. I think in our obvious and stories obvious points, and also in our kind of general psychological and nutritional points, we can kind of see that meat is more valuable than fruit. Okay. From a purely nutritional perspective, that's an interesting debate. But from a kind of more symbolic perspective, that makes sense, right? Meat is from a living thing, right? You had to be close to a living thing. You had to do a lot more to kind of create that life. And now giving it up is a greater sacrifice, therefore. Okay. So they do this. Now, here we go. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering. So, Abel, good job. I like the fat and the animals and all that kind of stuff that you put forward. But on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. So, Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. Okay. So, Cain, your sacrifices ain't good enough. Okay. So, that's not good. And as a result, Cain is upset. He is downcast. He is resentful and angry and sad about his situation, about God not accepting his sacrifices. This is the really irritating part now. Then the Lord God said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door and desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Okay, let's translate that. Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? Again, does God not know? It's rhetorical. He knows exactly why Cain's upset. So he says to Cain, like, dude, what's your problem, basically? Here we go. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? What is very clearly being implied there? I think what's being implied there is that, Cain, you are not doing what is right. But if you do not do what is right, sin's crouching at your door, desires to have you. You must rule over it. Okay, in other words, beware. Because if you are not following my commandments, if you are not doing what is right, sin is going to rule over you. Okay, sin is going to enter into your life and it's going to dominate or destroy your life. So, does Cain understand this? Does Cain know that what he was doing was not sufficient? I think there's a clear implication to that. God's three rhetorical questions, I think, very much carry the tone and the implication that Cain knew that what he was doing was not good enough, and yet he was still upset by it. That, guys and gals, is, I think, a very clear example of what we saw in the last story, or what we were warned against in the last story, at least subtly, which is this practice of self-deception. Cain knew what he was doing is wrong. Just as I think this story and a lot of stories in the Bible, and I think a lot of people can, debate this and discuss this, but I think that at some level, there's a good argument to be made that most of us really know if we're doing something wrong. I think we know when we make conscious decisions to do things. I think there's some deep, quiet part of us that might really at least sense that something is not good. And Cain, I think, is definitely exemplifying that. And God points that out to him. Now, Cain has been giving things up in life and working at least relatively hard, and then giving up some of the things that he, wants to sacrifice to God. And now he's upset for not being accepted and not, having good results from his sacrifices. And God turns around and tells him what? Whose fault is that? It's your fault. Okay. Now, how would Cain react to hearing that? With serious distress, right? With serious negative emotions. Because if you're going through life and you are working and you are trying to work and give things up so that you can have a better life, and then you continuously see that your quote unquote sacrifices are not being quote unquote accepted, in other words, that you're not getting anything back from the world the more and more you give up, you might, then someone turns around and says, yeah, well, guess whose fault that is? That's your fault. That's going to instill a lot of anger and resentment in people, and it does so in Cain. So much so that we jump to passage 8 here, and what happens? Now, Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Okay? So he murders his brother. He commits fratricide, the first true murder. Okay? Why? Why? Because he is angry. He's angry that he's not able to get what he wants from reality. He's angry, or that he is not getting what he wants from reality. He's angry that he will have to give up more, or that he was not doing properly, giving up proper sacrifices in the first place. He's angry about the fact that God just said this directly to him. He's angry that his younger brother is better than him, apparently, is a good guy and getting what he wants from God and making better sacrifices again and again and again and again. So we can just go down the list. He is angry. And so what do people do in their anger is, especially if it consumes them, is that they vent it out with destruction. And that is usually in the form of the destruction of life. Okay. So he kills Abel, he kills his brother, and also in some sense his idol, the one who was better than him here. Okay. The one who was really kind of showing him how insufficient he was. God says to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. Am I my brother's keeper?" Okay, famous interaction. Again, God knows. What is God doing? Same thing that he's doing in Genesis, or in the earlier book of Genesis, trying to say, "Tell me what you did." He says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" So again, like, I don't know, am I responsible for him? Yes. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. You are his older brother. You are his brother in general. You are a human being, right? You are someone who is responsible for the well-being of others around you to some degree, especially in this situation. So more and more self-deception here from Cain, though he's very, very much more unhealthy than Eve and Adam were, his parents were, when they were questioned by God. God says what? "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Okay, so famously, you read Edgar Allan Poe's Telltale Heart. This sounds familiar, right? The blood crying out to God from the ground. The guilt of what we have done rising up to torment us, right? There's a passage, I think, in the play Antigone that says the same thing. My father's blood rises out, or I think it's my father's blood or my father's ghost or something like that, rises from the grave to torment me. This idea of what we've done in the past, or what we've tried to bury subconsciously or literally, comes out to bother us again, okay? God says, now, anything you try to do now is not going to yield anything proper for you. Because you've adopted this way of being, you will definitely not get anything truly valuable from the world, right? This is a really, really terrible thing now. So any work that you do is not going to produce anything for you. And you will be restless and a wanderer on the world, okay? You're never going to have rest on this world. And Cain listens to this and he says, "This punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me out from the land. I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." And he says, "No, no one will kill you." And he basically kind of warns people not to kill him. He's like, "Nope, just leave this guy here to his suffering." Okay. So that's Cain and Abel. A lot of things here. Number one, what is Cain and Abel's relationship to one another, and explain what this expectations this might come with. We talked about that, right? Older brother, younger brother, all that kind of stuff. Making sacrifices. We talked about this. Number three, how does God react to Cain's sacrifice? And what is Cain's reaction? What is his emotional state? It's a rejection, of course. His reaction to this is resentment and anger. And what does God's response to him imply? What effect does this have on him? We talked about that. Why overall does Cain kill Abel, right? It is the irrational outpouring of anger and the desire for destruction and the desire for something to gnaw on with your resentment, okay? You could also say that it's him killing Abel Because Abel is essentially an idol to him. He's an idol of judgment to him. He kind of reminds Cain of all of his insufficiencies. So maybe that's why he does it. It could be all of them together. Number 6, what might the significance of his punishment? What might be the significance of Cain's punishment? Well, of course, we talked about that. That's essentially what happens when you adopt that type of relationship with reality, that type of relationship with people. When your resentment has controlled you to such a degree, you're not going to be able to get really anything truly meaningful or valuable from reality. I think that's the main point. And rest, of course, never going to get rest because you can never really come to peace with what you have done. And again, I think that's because of what Cain was doing. He was immediately practicing self-deception at many different levels, many different levels. And so now that's definitely going to make sure that he does not get any rest. So that's another paradox of psychology and spirituality, which is that it is only in confessing and in confronting what causes you anxiety that's really going to bring you peace overall. Never confronting it is going to ensure that you are forever tormented by it. Number 7, what insights about human nature might this story be trying to communicate? I think the main one is the nature of evil, one step removed from what we saw in the fall, the temptation of Adam and Eve. Now, not only is it someone wishing to be the arbiter of reality, it's like in Cain, not wanting to make proper sacrifices and trying to get away with kind of cheap sacrifices. I think it's also now showing us that the true nature of evil and dysfunction is what comes after that. So once you try to become the arbiter of reality, once you try to twist and break the world to however you want to make it look, you realize quite quickly that you can't do that. And then what results is frustration, right? You have frustration with this. You're not getting what you want. You're not able to kind of exist in the world as you truly want to be. You cannot come to grips with the fact that you are who you are and subject to the nature and the laws of the world. And as a result, you become what? This is the point. You become resentful. You start to hate reality and all those in it, especially those who are doing well when you are not doing well. I think that's clearly what this story is trying to communicate. There's a lot of other things it's trying to communicate. Tell me what else you think is being shown here, but that's, I think, the fundamental one. Okay, so now, even quicker, we're going to look at the New Testament. So the New Testament, of course, comes quite a bit while after, right? We're skipping tons of books and literature in between Genesis and the Gospels. But we're going to look now at more distinctly Christian literature in the Bible. And we're going to start, of course, with the Gospel of John, when it talks about the figure of Christ. So in literature, in our history and our philosophies, the figure of Christ is, without a doubt, the most influential and the most interesting. I wouldn't say interesting, that depends on your point of view, but it is definitely the most influential historical figure, I think, period, right? He kind of really exploded this religion, this worldview onto the world and has exacted such an immense impact in reality that it's almost undeniable that this was the most influential figure, Jesus of Nazareth, that ever existed. Now, within the stories of literature, within the stories of myth and all this other kind of stuff, we see Christ, or the figure of Christ, affect and influence the way that we create and understand characters and stories quite a bit. And what I want to do before we really tease out what that looks like and what that means is consider the setup that these texts are dealing with, the setup or the context that they're dealing with. What I mean by that is what essentially we just talked about in Genesis. What is the nature of reality in Genesis, as Genesis conveys it to us, that both the Jews and then, of course, the Christians would accept? It is that we, number one, live in a fallen, broken world, that reality is not as it should be. And that is fundamentally because of our dysfunction with it, right? There's something wrong fundamentally with us. We have a sinful nature. Though we are made in the image of God, we are still kind of covered up or kind of tainted by this sinful nature that we saw in Genesis, both in Cain and Abel and in Adam and Eve. And so we are constantly at strife with the world and with God. We are constantly kind of wrestling against these forces, and we are ever struggling to improve ourselves and to be good people and to have a more meaningful and a more virtuous and a more Zoe-like life. Okay, that's the setup. Then we get the Gospel of John. Let's see what it says. Passage 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Okay, so passage 1 through 4, Gospel of John. What's it talking about? It's talking about the beginning of time. So like Genesis stuff. What was in the beginning? The Word. Okay, bad translation, annoying translation. What this means in Greek, the term is logos. What the term means is, yes, word, so articulated speech, but it also means logic, but it also means rationality, means reason, but it also means meaning, okay? But it also means study and inquisitiveness, all this kind of stuff. It means all of this stuff together. So in the beginning was rational, comprehensive meaning, okay? And it was with God, and it was God. So at the same time, this word, this logos, whatever it is, was with God, but also was God. So God is the logos. Kind of, again, riffing, I think John, the author of this text, is riffing on the first line of Genesis. In the beginning was God, or in the beginning God made the heavens and the earth. So implying, God is the one in the beginning. God and the Word are the same thing, all this kind of stuff. So it's a weird, very, very weird kind of fractalish relationship, or tesseract-like relationship between God and the Word. It was in the beginning with God, nothing that was made by him was made without him, all this kind of stuff. So like it made the world. So it has equal power and status with God, as we understand God, although it is God itself. Okay. Number 5. And the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. So that is the logos, is the light, and it shines in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Interesting line right here that summarizes, I think, a fundamental point about the nature of evil. Is another point about evil and dysfunction that this story is putting forward, that this text, the Bible, is putting forward to us, which is that evil is fundamentally ignorant, that it is fundamentally lacking understanding, that it is fundamentally irrational, that it just doesn't understand how goodness works. So I think there's a wonderful C.S. Lewis quote like that says, heaven understands hell, but hell cannot understand heaven, right? So good point from the Gospel of John here. Number 6, there was a man sent from God whose name was John the Baptist. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. He was not that light, but he was sent to bear witness of that light. So, okay, so we got a guy who comes in named John, who's trying to kind of get people ready for this light of the world, this logos, this God. That was the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. Hold on to that line. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, and even to them that believed on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but God. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, and the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Okay, so we can basically stop there. 14 and 10 are the lines I really want to focus on. He, that is the light of the Word, the light of the Word, God, all the kind of stuff. God, fundamentally, was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. Okay, so God was in the world. Like, does that mean spiritually? Does that mean like he's kind of walking around, or he's kind of like, misty and all over the place? Maybe. I think what's really John's getting at is what he really more fully articulates here. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. Aha. So this God, this Word, this light was actually what the phrase really is incarnate, right? So infleshed. He was made into flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. Who is that then? So God becomes human, God becomes man. That, of course, is Jesus of Nazareth. That, of course, is Jesus Christ in the Christian religion. So these questions here, by the way, are so obvious. I mean, we just touched on all those kind of things. Now, what I really want to get at is this. What does John the Baptist reveal about the word? And it's all that kind of stuff. And how does this describe the central narrative, the teaching of Christianity? That's what we're talking about right now. What is the central narrative and the central teaching of Christianity? The central narrative is that, central story is that God incarnates himself into a human being named Jesus of Nazareth. So when you're looking at Jesus of Nazareth, according to Christianity, you're looking at God. Like, that is God. God is the Word, right? Christ is the Word of God, which also is God. So God comes into physical reality, comes into physical history with human beings. Why? Why? As the text was saying, so that what? Let's take a look. Blah, 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 cried the word, blah, 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 and the fullness we received with grace and grace. For the law was given to Moses, but by grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. Okay, bringing grace and truth, that's the main point. And of course, what? We beheld his glory full of grace and truth, and we beheld his glory, blah, 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 blah. And let's see, number 10, he was in the world, and the world received him not. So there's no clear description as to fundamentally why he's coming here, but it's essentially, I think, part of the whole idea, like we talked about in Genesis, that the world is in, to use John's language, darkness. The world is ignorant of God. The world doesn't understand goodness, doesn't understand how it needs to move forward. So, or is seriously broken and seriously kind of still suffering from sin and the state of the world that we described in Genesis. And so God comes into the world for what purpose? To then take people, or then to kind of help people get out of the darkness and kind of come back up to a higher reality, to a higher state of being, to a better state of being with him, essentially. Of course, though, there's conflicts, right? Because people still don't understand him. And then people will, as it says, reject him. So there's an interesting story here. God comes down into reality and tries to kind of rescue people and bring humanity in the world up to a higher reality. Now, does that mean literally he's like, I'm trying to throw you up to heaven right now? No, I think we're talking spiritual terms here with John. He's trying to kind of teach and guide people to a better way of living. And of course, like we know in Christianity, how is he going to really do that? He's going to allow himself to die, to be a sacrifice for people in order to kind of wipe the slate clean in some mystical way through, again, the Jewish understanding of sin and sacrifice and death and all this kind of stuff. He's going to offer his own life to be part of ours so that we no longer have to suffer the punishment that is owed from being sinful. That's kind of, again, the Christian atonement. And then the resurrection, of course, right? So that's the fundamental narrative of Christianity, is the idea that there's a figure who's going to essentially rescue us, to save us, to heal us from the fundamental brokenness of our reality. So part of the reason I like to introduce this, or kind of remind my English learners about this, English literature students about this, is because we see figures like this before Jesus, but then after Jesus, we see this kind of stuff all over the place. We see this struggle against a broken world, a broken nature, again and again through literature. We see Christ-like figures all over the place, or figures who are at least acting out some of the roles that Christ had, which, by the way, if you want to list them out, it'd be a great thing we can do here. Christ acts as in three general roles that Christian tradition usually kind of lists as priest, prophet, and king. They're his three fundamental roles that he acts out. Priest as being the person who sacrifices, does the sacrifice, right? He offers up his own blood and body on the altar of the cross, right? In order to what? In order to kind of reunite us with God, or kind of cleanse our sins in some mystical way. That's what he's doing. He's making a sacrifice. So when we see figures in literature who are sacrificial, self-sacrificial, dying for others, putting themselves in a position to protect others through their own potential or literal death, that is a very clear Christ-like figure. I mean, especially after 2000, after the year 30 BC or 30 AD. Yeah, when Christianity becomes a thing, we really see that much more prevalently. Now, the prophet role is, again, it's like we talked about in John here, as someone who is teaching, which we're going to talk about in our last reading today, where we see someone who is very clearly trying to reveal deeper realities about the future, or about the present and thus the future. And again, guys, a prophet is someone who is not, doesn't have mystical powers that can see the future. That's not what a prophet is. A prophet is someone who can see the present and see the truth in such clarity that they might as well just be able to tell what's going to happen very clearly in the future. That they give almost like an illusion of being able to see the future clearly. That's not what they're doing. They're just predicting, from the very clear signs that they can see. It's like, oh, if you keep walking, you're going to fall off a cliff. It's like, oh my gosh, you can tell the future. It's like, no, you can just see the cliff. That's kind of what a prophet does. So he has this role. And then you also see the kingship, right? This idea that he is a king, but a king that is presented how? As humble, right? So a king that is, in this state of glory, in the state of like supreme maximal value and glory, and then kind of lessens himself, kind of gives up the glory, comes down to essentially be a servant and be killed like a slave in order to kind of save his subjects, save his people, his children, if you want. He has lordship over all things like, demons and nature and all this other kind of stuff, and sin as well. He has lordship over all of that. And as a result, we then get figures, we get the notion in literature of lordship, of kingship, very clearly changed or tweaked a bit, right? You can do the usual Christian thing where you contrast this at the time with a figure like Augustus, or Tiberius Caesar. Caesar, this like demigod-like figure who we always need to pay homage to. He's kind of sitting up there on his marble throne all the time, kind of above everybody. Whereas the Christian idea of a king is someone who is what? Is someone who is much, much more humble, much, much more kind of covert, and judges the world by a completely different value system, right? So if you want to go back to what we talked about in Genesis, you can see in the Christian religion this contrast between what the world says is powerful, which is like that bios, right? Like kind of a kind of more secular, a more worldly form of power, which is like Caesar's power. Whereas you can see Jesus's form of lordship and power, which is that vertical form of power, which is that much more impressive, that much more long-lasting kind of spiritual power. And again, that kind of is exemplified in the resurrection. So all of those kind of ideas get trickled into the culture and then into the Christian philosophy and then the culture. And we get to see that kind of play out more and more and more through literature and through history. Okay, last one we're going to do. Speaking of Jesus's teachings, we're going to look at some parables. And parables are going to be very important for us because one of our short stories is actually going to be essentially an extended parable. We have 4 parables here. Now, genre, what is a parable? A parable is, I think, very clearly a metaphorical, a symbolic story that is meant to, a little story, like a small one, that is meant to convey a number of deeper teachings, okay? Not necessarily literal teachings. Again, not necessarily clear literal teachings. We don't want to take like hard theology, right, from a parable. But I think it's something that is, again, like a mythic reading of Genesis, something that's much more mythic and something that's much more deep and abiding about the nature of reality and the subjects of what we're talking about here. So the parable of the sheep and the goats. I'm not going to read the entire thing. I'm not going to read all these passages because we're running short on time. I want to instead kind of summarize them for you. And what we need to do here is essentially this. We need to go down here and we need to pick one of the parables. And we need to do 3 things, essentially. Number 1, identify the symbolic characters. Who do they represent? Identify the lesson Jesus is trying to convey, and then identify one line that summarizes a potential moral of the parable. So let's talk about the parable of the sheep and the goats, okay, from the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, or to the people that he's discussing with, that at the end of time, essentially, there's going to be 2 groups. The parable he gives are the sheep and the goats. The Lord God, or the king, right, the shepherd, whoever the figure would want to be here, that he uses is here, is going to look at the goats and say, what? You never clothed me. You never helped me, you never fed me, etc., when I needed to. Depart from me, go away. Now, the people who are the goats here are going to reply, well, we never saw you. What are you talking about? We never saw you that you were in need. And he will basically say to them, or then say to the goat or to the sheep, no, but you did. You did clothe me. You did feed me. You did give me shelter, all this kind of stuff. And then the sheep reply likewise, well, we never saw you, though. What are you talking about? And then Jesus reveals the main point here, which is that what? Yes, but you did it to the least of these. Whenever you saw someone that was suffering, that was in need of food, clothing, shelter, all this kind of stuff, you gave it to them. And he drops the line, of course, truly, truly, I say, whatever you've done to the least of these, this last line here, you have done it unto me. Okay. I tell you, whatever you did or did not do for the least of these, you did not do or you did do for me. Okay. So what is the point here? First of all, who are the obvious figures? The king, like the shepherd-like figure, that's very clearly, I think, God, right? That's Jesus. And who are the goats? I think the goats are very clearly supposed to be either people. This is tricky because they are people that seem to know the Lord. So interestingly, they are Christians, they are Jews, they are people who do believe in God, or maybe don't know or don't recognize him, right? So they could be non-believers, they could be believers, we don't know. But the fundamental characteristic that identifies one of them as a goat is that they don't actually help anyone that is in need around them. Whereas the sheep do. Again, we are not totally sure if the sheep know God or know Jesus or they don't. So there are people who are just generally kind of going about, and you see someone who's in need, the sheep help him, the goats don't. Okay. Now, Jesus says, whatever you did to the least of these, you do to me. So in other words, he is taking the actions done to others that are in need as actions done to him. He is identifying himself with the least people, the least traditionally valued people in society, the people who are, given the least, the people who are suffering the most, all this kind of stuff, who are the least, who have the least power in society. He's identifying himself with them. So much so that he says, any insult that you do to them is an insult to me. And so much so that he says, any good that you do them is a good done to me. Okay. That, I think, is the main point here. That is his essential moral. So if you want, the lesson here is to, number one, understand that theologically speaking, God, goodness, life, Jesus, if you want to be Christian about it, is in some sense present in all people, is identified with all people. And thus, an insult to another human being, a sin done against another human being, is a sin done to God, is a sin done against goodness and reality and all this kind of stuff. And so we need to, therefore, help all people, identify all people. There's another deeper level here, I think, that's also saying that if you are a Christian, if you are a Jew, you need to act like one. You need to actively help people, right? You can't sit in your room and pray all day, or just say that you're a pious person, but never do anything, but never help anyone that's in need. You need to actively be charitable. Okay, pretty simple. As for the line, I think that's pretty obvious, right? The line that really kind of sums that up is 45. So Matthew chapter 25 and verse 45. Okay. The parable of the prodigal son. Okay, probably the most famous parable in the entire Bible. It's this one. Prodigal son says what? There's a father who had, I think, a number of sons, two sons at most, or I'm sorry, at minimum. And one son comes to him and says, I want my inheritance now. The father gives it to him. Son goes off, spends it out in the wilderness, okay? And then, is totally out of money, is on hard times, and has to eat, the slop, like for pigs, essentially. He's so poor. He comes back begging his father, saying that, like, thinking that his father is going to be the only one who can help him now. He prepares and he says, I have sinned against my father. I've sinned against, the Lord. I've sinned against all this kind of stuff. So he heads towards his father, and his father runs out of the house after seeing him arrive and embraces him and greets him and brings him in and gives a party and all this kind of stuff. Okay. Now, and in doing so, his other son feels a little bit jealous and thinks like, well, wait a minute, like you're giving him all this kind of stuff. I never did any of the things he did. I was always, loyal to you. But now you're giving him more than you gave me, or you're kind of celebrating more than you celebrate me. And the father basically says, no, you don't understand. It's like, I'm celebrating the fact that he is alive now, right? That he is back, that we thought he was dead and now he is alive again. He is lost and now he is found. And that's the parable. Okay. So who are the characters here? What's the point? Let's actually do this. And let's do the characters. Let's do the normal sequence first. So the characters in the prodigal son. The father. I think it's very clearly father, shepherds, kings, right? That's God, right? That's very clearly supposed to be a figure of God. The two brothers. Number one, I think very much like the sheep and the goats, you have one son who follows the law, who's following the father's orders and is a good son. That's, I think, very clearly a quote unquote lawful good Christian, someone who is following God's commandments and trying to be close to God's heart. Whereas you have the other son who is, I think, very clearly shown to be someone who is not close to God's heart, is a very deep sinner, right? Someone who sins a little bit more than most. And that's, I think, the major figures that we need to worry about here. Now, when we get to the lesson, what is the lesson that Jesus is trying to convey here? A couple things, right? And we need to, of course, understand the context, right? When the son asks the father for his inheritance, deep insult right there, because when do you get your inheritance? You get your inheritance when the parent dies, okay? That's when you get it. So when you ask a parent for their inheritance now, you're basically saying, like, I wish you were dead. It's really insulting. So he takes it and he goes and spends it, frivolously, and he behaves like a complete loser playboy out in the wilderness. And then he has to, eat the slop of the pigs and all this kind of stuff. And he's a sinner, okay? He's a very, very, let's use Jesus' language, sinner that is full of death, someone that is essentially dead, right? Now, spiritually dead, of course, using that term Zoe again. And he comes back. And before he can get to the door, his father comes out and embraces him. Again, Middle Eastern point that most of us don't understand. When you enter into a home as a guest, first person you go and greet is the father. The father doesn't move, okay? You go to the father. You go to the figure of authority. Good lesson, by the way. Boys who are visiting their girlfriend's home, you go in and you immediately go and address the parents and say, thanks for having me, all this kind of stuff. Good manners. Same thing was the case in the Middle East. So the notion of a father getting up, getting out of the house and rushing out to greet his child is insane, right? Like that's whoa, like that's them demonstrating a serious amount of love right there. What's more is that he's demonstrated that amount of love for someone who had insulted him incredibly, right? So this overflowing amount of love and forgiveness is like the iconic and the main dominant feature of this figure. Joy, love, forgiveness, all this kind of stuff, reassurance, welcoming, like acceptance of him, all this kind of stuff. Radical, love is what we're seeing here. Which, by the way, doesn't mean that any of what he did was excused or condoned. That's not what we mean by love, by the way. It's like that stuff is bad, as we're going to see at the end here. That stuff was bad, but now you're back here. This is awesome. Like, come back. So what do we see then? The father, pours out the celebrations and all this kind of stuff, and the other son is a little bit jealous about this. He's kind of like a little bit upset. He's like, you never did any of this stuff for me. And we get this line, the killer line, I think, is really for the whole parable. He says, my son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. So in other words, all of this stuff was yours already. But we have to celebrate and be glad because your brother, the brother of yours, was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Okay, what do we mean by this, alive and dead again? I think, again, that's a reference back to this idea of Zoe. He was spiritually dying. It's not that we thought he was dead out in the wilderness, which might have, but it's this idea that, like, his soul was dying because of how he was behaving. Now he is coming back to life. That is something to celebrate, okay? So a couple things to get straight here. The love and forgiveness of the father was always there, when the son was there and then when he was not. the identification of his behavior as sinful and as, death inducing was always true, right? So just because the father, always loves him doesn't mean that I'm condoning what you're doing, right? There's a difference there, right? I can still love you, but I can hate the things that you're doing, right? There's that old idea. Now, the rejoicing at his return is, an expression of both of those things now. And what I think we see the second brother being invited to do is being trying to understand that, but also trying to be a little bit more humble and be like, you already have everything, you already have everything of mine. You already have my love. You already have my, all that I have to offer, so let's have it, and be happy, be glad that your brother is alive again. Think less of what of what you already have, which you do have a lot, and think about, how amazing what is going on here is. Okay. Now, the Good Samaritan here. Okay. Really, really kind of long passage in some sense. Pause. A brief announcement. Yeah. So the next passage that we have, the parable of the Good Samaritan. What we basically see here is Jesus telling the story about a Samaritan who was a racial bad guy, let's put it that way, a tribe and a race that the Israelites really did not like at the time. So, think KKK and BLM, like they don't get along, right? So the Samaritan is, hit by robbers and all this kind of stuff. He falls on the road, and rabbis and all these people kind of come by. I'm sorry, no, it was a who was it that was on the road? I always get this wrong. I'm sorry. Who was walking on the road? A man was going down. So just a man, a man was going down the road, and it was he was hit by robbers. He was come upon by robbers. He was beaten up, and rabbis, keep coming, and they're like, they're not going to do much for him, and they kind of just pass him by, and a Samaritan comes by, again, of this racial group that we don't really like in Israel. He comes by and he helps the man up, gets him cleaned up, brings him to an inn, and pays for his treatment at the inn, his kind of resuscitation at the inn. And that's it. And Jesus says what? Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The people said, the one who had mercy on him. He says, go and do likewise. Okay. So this is coming off the heels of Jesus saying, what is, by the way, the greatest commandment in Judaism and Christianity, which is kind of a two-pronged commandment, which is love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself, which are essentially the same thing, because as we saw in the parable of the sheep and the goats, God identifies himself with his people. So love people, aka love God and people, together with all your heart, strength, soul, and mind. And one of the people says, well, who's my neighbor? And then thus Jesus goes into this parable. And the point of the parable, I think, is, guys, is that your neighbor is whoever is around you that is in need, especially, right? Whoever's around you, no matter who they are, even if they're on the side of the road, that's your neighbor, right? If there's someone in the gas station with you, that's your neighbor. If there's someone in the bathroom with, stall with you, that's your neighbor. It's all this kind of stuff. Anybody around you is your neighbor. Anyone you come in contact with is your neighbor. Love them, have mercy on them, no matter what racial group or what ethnic group they come from, okay? So I think that's a really clear one here. I'm not going to go through the details of who you think stands for who. I'm going to let you do that. But that's the essential moral, I think, of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, the shepherd and the sheep, really kind of quick one. Jesus basically says, there's a shepherd who, what if there was a shepherd basically who had a flock of 100 sheep, and 99 of them were safe, but one of them went missing. He would leave the 99 and go looking for the one. And he basically says, there is just as much rejoicing in heaven when one sinner repents than over 99 persons who do not need to repent. He's basically showing here what? The figures, I think, obviously, by the way, God is the shepherd, of course, Christ, God are the shepherds. The sheep, of course, are people. The sheep that are not lost are the people who are following God's laws, are loving God and all that kind of stuff, and living in abundance and all that. You don't need to repent. Whereas the one who is lost is very much like the prodigal son, someone who is spiritually dying, someone who is not following the law, someone who is sinning, all that kind of stuff, being dysfunctional. And what God is basically saying here, what Christ is saying here, is that God, number one, will go out and seek that one, loves that one, even if it's just one. So in other words, like, God is displeased even if there's one person in hell, right? That he doesn't want it to be a numbers game. He loves everyone equally and profoundly and maximally. And the rejoicing over just one returning is enormous. So again, just like the parable of the prodigal son, we have this idea of God's, overwhelming kind of rapturous, joyful love for people who, or when people especially come back into life with him. Okay, so what do we see in these parables that kind of influence the philosophy and the literature and the culture moving forward? We see a constant, if you haven't caught it, identification of value with the poor. So poor or lesser people or people in need, people who are needing help, we are identifying the need and the value of those people in our necessity to go and help them. That's a huge point here. We're identifying this notion of universal love, okay? Which most people kind of looking at this, we talked about this, by the way, in the humanities class, we can see very clearly that this is going to ripple out and become the tidal wave of equal rights, that we really talk about in America a lot, whether it be with Blacks, Indians, Jews, whoever, and or women, right, too, like anybody who wasn't given a lot of rights, but then ended up being given a lot of rights, very much driven by the biblical worldview. Okay, so we see that quite a bit. We see God's universal love. We see the treatment of people that are lesser than us. We also see, in some sense, the what do you want to call it? The need for people to kind of overcome their kind of jealous or somewhat kind of like judgmental attitudes, right? Like what we saw in the parable of the Good Samaritan, and like we see in the parable of the prodigal son. Some people, still want or still don't know how to react when someone is given these grand celebrations of God. It's like, you already have a lot, you do have a lot, and you have everything that they have as well. And what we're rejoicing about right now is the fact that they are coming back into that idea of Zoe, that idea of life. Okay, we will see how these texts, how the whole religion, the whole worldview of the Bible influenced literature the more we move through this course. That was a lot just kind of thrown at you right now, but we'll keep bringing these things back up. So that's all we have for today. Moving forward, we're going to start looking at a little bit of Greek mythology. Very briefly, we're going to just look at a couple of passages on Greek mythology, and then we will move forward from there. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye.